From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Biden vowing to return to the campaign trail despite a growing list of Democrats now publicly calling for him to drop his re-election bid, and amid more leaks about private conversations of a potential exit.
This is the newly minted Republican ticket. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance wrap a week at the RNC in Milwaukee and get set to campaign in Michigan this weekend. We'll have more on the state of the race with political scientist Lara Brown.
And American journalist Evan Gershkovich is convicted of espionage in Russia, sentenced to 16 years in prison. We'll get reaction from the husband and daughter of another journalist imprisoned in the country in a special conversation later this hour. Kaylee, welcome back to the nation's capital. Interesting ride back from Milwaukee. Despite the CrowdStrike fiasco this morning, we managed to make our way back following 4 days at the Republican National Convention. And we're supposed to, of course, be talking all about Donald Trump's speech last night, but Joe Biden seems to be making more news today, or at least the people around him.
Yeah, certainly, as the list of Democrats calling for him to exit the race gets longer and longer, with now a third senator, multiple more members of the House, including from key constituencies like the Hispanic and Black caucus. And, of course, Joe Biden saying he will be returning to the campaign trail next week. And his campaign chair, Jen O'Malley Dillon, on MSNBC earlier today, had this to say about his commitment to his re-election bid.
Of people that stand with the president is bigger and wider than the people that don't want him to run. And those are the people that are doing the work in the states that really matter. And I am confident when we get back to being able to go take the case to Donald Trump, we have the time to do it, and we can bring home the people that have some concerns or are a little undecided today, because when they see those two head to head and the visions they have for this country, there is no doubt in my mind that the American people are going to be with Joe Biden.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Wendy, Benjaminson, and Megan Scully for more. So, Megan, just to begin with you, because it's Congress that seems to be making all the news here. Joe Biden seems persistent, at least at this point, in his statements that he is staying in this race. He is still running against Donald Trump. A lot of members of Congress beg to differ. The headline literally just crossing the Bloomberg terminal that Representative Vasquez of New Mexico, according to Sema4, is now calling on Biden to step aside. I believe that would make a dozen in the last 24 hours, Megan. Yes,
they are piling on. This is the fastest that we've seen since in the last 3 weeks, since the disastrous debate. A lot of these members are worried about their own re-elections, and they're worried about losing the House, or not winning back the House majority as they had hoped, and losing the Senate. So this isn't just about the presidential campaign anymore.
Well, it's interesting when we start putting all the headlines together, because it takes a lot of stories to kind of build the composite here of what's really going on behind the scenes. Wendy, we understand Kamala Harris will be addressing donors now, that Joe Biden is, in fact, talking with family members about this, that members of the cabinet, the call coming from inside the House, are talking about how to convince the president of this now. Are we within days of a decision or an announcement?
Well, we don't know. The thing is that all those headlines that you accurately reported in that setup have all been denied by the Biden campaign and the White House, but they've been denying that he's old, too. I mean, they've been denying that he's unable to finish the campaign and to be president for another 4 years. So it's kind of hard to tell. Kamala Harris, the vice president, the heir apparent to the nomination if Biden were to step aside. She did meet with donors today, but apparently her message was, we're in this to win it together. Let's all stick together. That's the public message. Not quite sure what she might have said. She's got a really interesting row to hoe, because she has to remain the loyal lieutenant until she is not the loyal lieutenant, until she actually has an opportunity to step up. So it's difficult for a politician like herself, who really does want to be in the Oval Office someday.
Well, of course, Kamala Harris has been able to be out and about for the last several days, while Joe Biden has been isolating in Delaware. And she spoke yesterday during a campaign event and had this to say about former President Donald Trump just hours before his RNC speech.
You cannot claim you stand for unity if you are pushing an agenda that deprives whole groups of Americans of basic freedoms, opportunity, and dignity. You cannot claim you stand for unity if you are intent on taking reproductive freedoms from the people of America and the women of America. And you cannot claim to be for unity when your entire economic agenda is designed to prioritize billionaires and big corporations over the middle class.
So, Wendy, she's clearly trying to focus this on Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden after Donald Trump spoke at the RNC last night. Does it feel like it's actually Donald Trump that is being focused on, or his policies that were outlined over the course of the last week at all?
Well, the White House and the campaign are desperately trying to make it about Donald Trump, but every time they do, even with Donald Trump's stem winder of a speech last night, the headlines are still mostly about, is he in or is he out? Is Joe Biden in or is he out? The beneficial thing for Kamala Harris, as I was saying earlier, is that she is doing robust, vigorous, athletic campaigning. She is a prosecutor. She's an able prosecutor, and she was really making a case there, which Joe Biden, with his raspy voice, is unable to make. So she's sort of serving two aims there at the same time, where she's showing herself as an able candidate, yet being loyal in taking it to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is still out there being Donald Trump. So
two of the most notable names that we've heard added to the list calling for Joe Biden to step down, certainly in the past couple of days, would be Adam Schiff and then today Zoe Lofgren, both coming out of the Pelosi camp here, allies, proteges of Nancy Pelosi. Is she, in the end, the one to orchestrate this?
She is probably the strongest voice orchestrating this behind the scenes. She is a masterful politician, and she knows how to win. She does not like to lose. And what I think she is seeing is that they are going to lose the House with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. So she's really working behind the scenes. We've seen many of her allies come out in the past several days, but she's careful about it. She herself is giving kind of more cryptic comments, like we saw last week on an MSNBC interview, where she has not expressly said the president should step aside, but she knows how to work the back channels to make that happen.
Well, that's certainly what we're hearing. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson and Megan Scully, we thank you for the analysis and great reporting today as we turn to another major story resonating here in the Capitol and all over the country. The major tech outage causing problems for travelers and businesses. Cybersecurity company CrowdStrike caused a global outage after pushing a faulty update to Windows computers. This was not an attack, it was an update. Following the outage, CrowdStrike CEO George Kurtz had this to say on NBC News.
The system was sent an update, and that update had a software bug in it and caused an issue with the Microsoft operating system. And we identified this very quickly and remediated the issue. And as systems come back online, as they're rebooted, they're coming up and they're working. And now we are working with each and every customer to make sure that we can bring them back online.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Jamie Taraby for more on this. Jamie, give us a sense of where we are here in recovering systems. We're still, a lot of us, hearing from friends and family stuck at airports around the country. How close are we to getting beyond it?
My goodness, just listening to him say that they're talking to every single customer. Those are a lot of customers and they're all over the planet. So it's going to be a really long trek here. One of the things that I've been hearing is not only is the advice to reboot systems, but reboot them sometimes up to 15 times. And so if the process that's involved is so complicated, it will take too much time to explain. But in a lot of cases, it will involve people physically sending in their devices to the administrator, who has to do a very laborious process to get everything changed. And I think, you know, it's a lot of the things are starting to ease up, but we're still a ways away from actually going back to normal. You know, George Kurtz said that, you know, they're trying to find ways to automate the solution, and that's really going to be the difference between how quickly they can get things back up and running as like they were yesterday.
Well, of course, it's caught the attention here in Washington. President Biden was briefed on this today, and we saw from Congresswoman Nancy Mace of the House Oversight Committee that they're potentially going to be looking for testimony from CrowdStrike and Microsoft when it comes to this issue. I wonder if one of those lines of inquiry is to how exactly one company could be so disruptive around the world. Is this going to raise like antitrust competition questions, Jamie?
I think that's a really good point, Kayleigh. I think that just the question of how does one tiny little piece of software embedded in the systems of an incredibly dominant player like Microsoft just paralyze systems around the world? There's also a lot of questions about quality assurance and quality control. Like, how was this update able to be released? Was there testing? What happened? CrowdStrike has promised full transparency. They're doing an analysis. They're doing investigation. They've promised to share all their findings. And look, if there's going to be questions whether Microsoft gets pulled in front of the Congress or CrowdStrike does, they also have to respond to their shareholders and they also have to respond to their customers. So this is not going to be an easy time for CrowdStrike, not for any money, not for a long time, unfortunately.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't an easy day if you're looking at the trading action. Bloomberg's Jamie Taraby, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, we'll take a deeper dive into the cratering support for President Biden's reelection campaign, at least among some in his party, with political scientist Lara Brown. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Absolutely, the president's in this race. You've heard him say that time and time again. And I think we saw on display last night exactly why, because Donald Trump is not going to offer anything new to the American people. He's the same person he was in 2020. He's the same person he was at the debate stage. He's the same person he is that is about himself and not about the American people. And Joe Biden is more committed than ever to beat Donald Trump.
More committed than ever. That was Biden-Harris campaign chair Jen O'Malley Dillon speaking earlier today on MSNBC, explaining that the president has no plans to leave the race. This is in the face of growing pressure from within his own party to do so. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we're joined now by Lara Brown, political scientist and author of Amateur Hour, Presidential Character, and the Question of Leadership. Lara, welcome back to Bloomberg. We have the question about really one leader today, on a day in which we should be debriefing Donald Trump's speech at the RNC last night, and said it does feel like it's all about Joe Biden and his future as the Democratic nominee or not. I'm not sure if you're a betting woman, but do you think it's Joe Biden when we get to the next convention next month?
I do not. I will also say that I think President Biden needs to recall that George Washington was lauded and remains to be sort of honored for the fact that he stepped away from power. I know he did it after 2 terms, but he had people pleading with him to stay for 3. So I think President Biden would do well to step aside for the Democratic Party.
There are so many questions, then, Lara, about what happens next. Questions about Kamala Harris, whether there should be a James Carville-style free-for-all where we travel the country and do a series of town halls to pick a candidate. Some suggest that type of drama might do a lot to create a more active base, energize voters, go up against Donald Trump with a more interesting story, bring a bit of drama into the cycle. Others say, no, that's chaos, and you're handing the race over to Donald Trump if you don't stick with Kamala Harris, stick with the delegates and the money at hand. It's a massive decision. How does the party handle it?
So let me back up and just say that actually that's why I would argue that President Biden didn't even contemplate stepping aside last fall. The reality is, former President Trump, according to the Democrats, is an existential threat to our democracy. And President Biden knows that typically when parties have divisive primary elections, they do not fare well come November because they are unable to come back together and unite behind someone. It's clear that President Biden has said to himself, I'm the only one who has bested Donald Trump, and therefore I'm probably the only one who can again beat him. Unfortunately, that is not the perception that most of the voters have at this point, given the stamina and energy and sort of enthusiasm that President Biden has been prosecuting this case against Donald Trump. So looking forward, I would say that President Biden is staying in this race, frankly, as long as possible, partly to narrow the time frame that you would have discussions about who might replace him. Because I do think he knows it is his responsibility to turn this over to his vice president, who he selected early on, and he would like to see, I believe, succeed him. But what that means is there has to be unity that is the solution, logistically and also coalitionally. And what is happening right now, and what's been happening over the last 3 weeks, is that Vice President Harris has been able to go out there and make more of a case every day that she is the right person to take the campaign to former President Trump.
Well, on the subject of the former president, of course, he spoke for a long time during his speech at the RNC last night. It was more than an hour and a half long, but he began by reflecting on the failed assassination attempt this past weekend. Here's a little taste.
These are great people at great risk, I will tell you, and pounced on top of me so that I would be protected. There was blood pouring everywhere, and yet, in a certain way, I felt very safe because I had God on my side.
Talking about God and the Secret Service protecting him, Lara, he talked extensively about his experience last Saturday at the beginning of the speech. But as we moved through it, we got more meandering, much more ad-libbing, going off the script. And again, it lasted a very long time. Did Donald Trump bring more people into his corner last night, or does it remain the case that Donald Trump is essentially static in his support? It's just Joe Biden who's losing his.
I think it's the latter. I think it is true that former President Trump attempted some unity message in the beginning, but quite frankly, he realized that his audience was not responding. It was very quiet. There were not many sort of rousing cheers during even what was a fairly dramatic portrayal of his assassination attempt, and then his calls for sort of coming together. And with that, you know, former President Trump is a performer. He is a celebrity reality star. He knew he needed to sort of amp up the drama. So what did he do? He returned to those rally platitudes that excite his base and make his supporters love him. That doesn't help him expand sort of his coalition. And certainly it turns off anyone who maybe isn't already with him or wasn't already in the hall.
Political scientist Lara Brown, we thank you, Lara, for being back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, Meta CEO, co-founder Mark Zuckerberg making comments on the assassination attempts against Donald Trump in an exclusive interview with Bloomberg's Emily Chang. We'll have some of that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Mark Zuckerberg of Meta says he will not be endorsing a candidate in this year's presidential election, and that his social media empire will feature less political content. He sat down yesterday with Bloomberg's Emily Chang in Menlo Park, California.
I want to talk about the 2024 presidential election.
Okay.
Facebook has been a flashpoint in many elections around the world, and you personally have been called out, most recently by former President Trump. This is a big election. What do you think is at stake?
Well, I mean, look, it's obviously a very important and it'll be a historic election. You know, I feel like I'm best positioned maybe to talk about what our role will be in it and what we're going to do. And look, I mean, the main thing that I hear from people is that they actually want to see less political content on our services because they come to our services to connect with people. So, you know, that's what we're going to do, where we give people control over this, but we're generally trying to recommend less political content. So I think you're going to see our services play less of a role in this election than they have in the past. And personally, I'm also planning on not playing a significant role in the election. You know, I've done some stuff personally in the past. I'm not planning on doing that this time. And that includes, you know, not endorsing either of the candidates. Now, look, I mean, there's obviously a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world. I mean, the historic events over over the weekend. And I mean, on a personal note, it's, you know, I mean, seeing Donald Trump get up after getting shot in the face and pump his fist in the air with the American flag is one of the most badass things I've ever seen in my life. But, and I think, look, at some level as an American, it's like hard to not get kind of emotional about that spirit and that fight. And I think that's why a lot of people like the guy. But look, I mean, we're living in a pretty crazy time, and I view our role here is to make it so that everyone can express their views on this stuff, but we're going to try to manage it so that way the politics doesn't drown out the human connection and the community, which is, I think, the main thing that people come to our services for. And you know, we're not always going to get that right, but that's what we're going to try to do, and I think that's probably the best role that we can play.
You can watch the full exclusive interview with Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg on The Circuit with Emily Chang on July 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time in New York on Bloomberg Television, or you can stream it at 8:30 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg Originals. Of course, while Mike Zuckerberg there described Donald Trump's moves this past weekend as showing he's a badass, not endorsing him, unlike other tech CEOs who have done so, like Elon Musk in the immediate aftermath of that shooting, Joe.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, too, as we've discussed the impact of the J.D. Vance pick when it comes to high tech, someone who's more on the side of the Biden administration when it comes to antitrust than maybe what we've seen from Donald Trump. So I'm not sure how that shakes out when these two sit down together and talk.
Well, we'll continue to assess it on this program. But coming up first, we'll talk about Evan Gershkovich, sentenced to 16 years in prison in Russia. Stick with us as we speak with the family of another journalist detained in the country next on Bloomberg.
When you look to the recent news and that you see that a U.S. journalist is condemned to 16 years in jail, it's quite important to understand that it's not only a war against Ukraine, of course, it's first of all that, but it's a war against our values in the EU, but also in the free world.
That was Didier Reynders, the European Commissioner for Justice, speaking with us earlier today after a Russian court announced the sentence for Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. President Biden releasing a statement this morning saying, quote, "We are pushing hard for Evan's release and will continue to do so. There is no question that Russia is wrongfully detaining Evan. Journalism is not a crime. We will continue to stand strong for press freedom in Russia and worldwide and stand against those who seek to attack the press or target journalists," unquote. Now, joining us now is someone who knows a lot about this. Pavel Butorin, back with us, the husband of Russian detainee Alsu Kurmasheva and their daughter Bibi Butorin. It's great to see both of you with us here in Washington. Thank you for coming to sit down, Pavel. I just wonder your thoughts on this day when you get news like this from Evan and how that hits you personally, what it means for your family.
Russia's legal system is a sham. No one should be giving it any credence. There's no due process. There's no presumption of innocence. As a matter of fact, the Russian leader declared Evan a CIA spy several months ago before the trial. Of course, we find this news to be very troubling. Now, Alsu's case is covered in secrecy, even though she's not accused of espionage or treason. But as far as we know, the case is going to trial at some point where we don't even know the date. The trial may as well have taken place as far as we know. So we really don't know what's happening. The Russian government has produced no evidence to prove that Alsu has done anything wrong, that any of her reporting has contained falsehoods or inaccuracies. She's not a criminal. We miss her very much. She belongs home with us at home, not in a Russian prison cell.
Well, and how much harder, Bibi, does that lack of transparency about what exactly is happening with her, what her condition is, knowing we're talking about your mom here, how much harder does it make this whole thing for your family?
I think it's already hard for me to be away from my mom for so long, but knowing that she's in a dangerous situation and that we don't quite know what's going to happen next troubles me and my younger sister a lot.
I'm sure it does. You just turned 16, is that right? That's been 2 years, Pavel, you said.
This was Bibi's second birthday without her mother.
What was it like to celebrate your birthday this time?
It's always very strange because last year I really thought that she would be back here with me now. And so now, since I had this second birthday without her, it makes me feel like there's less hope in my heart.
Well, as we talk about hope, you obviously celebrated that birthday here in Washington. Have you had conversations with administration officials? What are you hearing, Pavel, from the U.S. government?
First of all, I appreciate the support that we as a family have received from the U.S. government. The government is on our side. There's no divide, no partisan divide when it comes to support for all Americans detained abroad. However, we still are advocating for Alsu to be designated wrongfully detained. Obviously, my ultimate goal is to bring Alsu back to her daughters, not to get a government designation. However, this designation would be an important step to that end. Regardless of the designation, we want Alsu to be treated as an American. She is a naturalized American. As I've been saying, we cannot rely on the Russian legal system for justice. So we count on the U.S. government to help us bring Alsu back home.
So talk to us more about the problem here, because you've called out the U.S. government for the double standard. Evan Gershkovich did get that designation, being wrongfully detained. Why is it not happening in this case, and what difference would it make?
Well, this is a question better asked to the Biden administration and the State Department. Again,
Do you get an answer?
We have been getting answers, and I do appreciate some level of opacity there. That system is very opaque to the families of those detained abroad. And I'm often told that, we don't need the designation to negotiate a trade that would include Alsu. Mm-hmm. But then that begs the question, why do we need the Levinson Act that regulates this designation? Again, my goal is to bring Alsu back home. If we can do that without the designation, that's fine. But the designation is also a symbolic step, for all of her fellow journalists, American journalists, to know that if you are a journalist and you are detained by an adversarial regime in line of duty, you are supported by your government, and your detention is wrongful. There can be no hesitation among U.S. government officials to designate Alsu as wrongfully detained.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alsu obviously is a journalist. She's also, Bibi, the woman who raised you. What else would you want, not just the U.S. government, but the world to know about her and about her case?
I would say that my mom is probably the kindest person you will ever meet. She's a connector. Every person she meets instantly really likes her. And she is the last person in the world to deserve something like this. She really is just a normal mom, and it's heartbreaking for us that she's been away from us for so long.
Yeah, you talked about your sister. Go ahead, Pavel, if you want to add.
I wanted to add, Bibi, if you don't mind, I also want people to know, and hopefully Alsu to know, and one day she will know that too, that no matter what these unjust Russian courts find her or Evan guilty of, we know that she is not a criminal. We, her family, we know that she has done nothing wrong. Mm-hmm. The world knows that she has done nothing wrong. Her government knows that she has done nothing wrong. And Alsu will come back, will return to us, to the free world, as a hero. But her captors will forever bear that shame of tormenting an innocent woman, an innocent daughter of two young daughters, mother of two young daughters, sorry.
We look forward to talking with you the day that happens. You mentioned your sister. To what extent do you and your siblings support each other through this? It must be an important part this whole story?
My sister is my best friend, and I think we've unfortunately grown closer throughout this situation. And I think that family in this case is super important. And we talk to each other a lot, and we talk about how we miss our mom and how we just want her back.
Yeah.
Well, that's understandable. Pavel, as you talk about the idea that her captors ultimately will be held to account, or it will be known what they've done here, we're talking about Russia. And we're in the middle of an election cycle in which it's unclear who the next president will be and what their approach to Russia will be. As we just consider the timeline here, are you worried about what might happen to Alsu's case if, say, it's a second Trump administration, or do you think it won't actually change much?
Well, I'm speaking from my experience, dealing with representatives, members of Congress, and senators. I have not seen any divide, any partisan divide over this issue. As a matter of fact, some of our strongest supporters come from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, for example, Chairman McCall. So I think Russia and the Russian government needs to understand that no matter who wins the White House, either administration will prioritize rescuing Americans held abroad. I hope so. I believe that's the case.
Well, we'll continue to prioritize their stories here at Bloomberg as well. Thank you for sharing yours with us, Bibi and Pavel Butorin. We appreciate your time and look forward to the day that you can have Alsu home with you. And still ahead, we'll return to our top story, the uncertainty hanging over President Biden's reelection campaign. We'll have more next with our political panel on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
If I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark, and I would not be here tonight. 4 months from now, we will have an incredible victory, and we will begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country. I will end the electric vehicle mandate on day 1, thereby saving the U.S. auto industry from complete obliteration. That means 2 things on day 1, right? Drill, baby, drill, and close our borders. So I better finish strong, otherwise we'll blow it, and we can't let that happen.
Former President Donald Trump last night accepting the Republican nomination for president in Milwaukee, listing off a string of plans and grievances following a pledge to unify the country. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kayleigh Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, and joining us now is our political panel. Kristen Hawn, Rokk Solutions partner and Democratic strategist, and Lisa Camooso Miller, former communications director for the RNC and the host of the Friday Reporter podcast. So typically on this day after the RNC, you might think we would be talking about the man who just accepted the nomination. Instead, we're talking about the man who has yet to do so, and the question is if he ever will. President Biden facing growing calls from within the Democratic Party, Kristen, to drop out of the race, yet he says he's returning to the campaign trail next week. So what's really going on?
I think there's a lot of stuff going on within the party.
Clearly.
That is not, but they're not airing out, right? There are conversations happening among members, among leadership. Some things I think are leaked. I think they're strategically leaked. And there's a real question about how to move forward. I think it would be very interesting. You know, my mom actually texted me, and I always say that Margaret Hawn is like the best political, advisor. But she's like, how interesting would it be if we actually had a convention where you had, so I think that there are a lot of questions right now. And I haven't met anybody that knows any or all of the answers. I think Biden wants to stay in. I think there are a lot of calls among the rank and file, too. The so-called frontliners, the people who are the majority makers for the Democratic Party are concerned about their ability to win with the Biden, when he's the candidate.
Yeah. Is a contested convention something that would actually help Democrats or create the chaos that would allow Donald Trump to close the deal?
Well, it's so hard to say, Joe, but I really think right now that there is such a craving for anyone else to be in this race that it very well could be the kind of change agent that would upset everything that's happening inside of the campaign right now on both sides of the aisle. So I think that alone is one that I think we're going to watch and we're going to have to see.
Well, as we think about both sides of the aisle, there is a pretty stark contrast between the one side and the other. One side was gathered in Milwaukee, but the numbers of tens of thousands this week rallying around Donald Trump, who was greeted by that audience as he spoke for more than 90 minutes yesterday. The other is where it seems to be more disunity than the unity message that Republicans are singing. I guess my question, though, Lisa, is whether or not Donald Trump really did sing that unity message last night, when we saw at some point the speech turned into not a teleprompter situation, but just another rally ad lib, meandering thought.
Well, this is probably an unpopular thought, but it's definitely the thought that I've had, and that was that he left more on the table than he should have. If the former president, had spoken for 20 minutes last night and finished that speech the way he had, this would have been locked up and it would have been over. But I do think that 90-minute speech, that rambling speech, he lost a lot of people. Again, was reminded that this is all about Donald Trump. And so the first 3 days were very, very strong. And I think a lot of people, even people like myself who are not necessarily aligned with the former president, thought again about how it is the party really could rally around someone like him. Last night, I think, reminded people why it is they're not in favor of him as the nominee ultimately.
A city wouldn't mention Joe Biden, and he did twice. Hannibal Lecter got a mention, and Hulk Hogan made an appearance. What do Democrats do? Because I know you see an opportunity there when you think about suburban women, when you think about non-white men. Who else were they talking to last night, and how did Democrats pick this up for Chicago?
That's the thing. I mean, you've got a convention, the Republican convention, where they were clearly speaking to their base with the vice presidential nominee and J.D. Vance. I mean, there's no, attempt to, let's say, have a woman, as the vice presidential candidate. There's no attempt. It's just all, let's get out the base. Let's do all of this. Is that enough to take him over the edge? I'm looking at all these polls in these swing states that we say, Michigan. A lot of the concerns about Biden have already been baked in. So I think that's why there hasn't been so much of a swing as that you've seen. But no, there was no attempt to reach out to anybody different than who he's always talking to. I think they're relying on that that Trump base to come out and take him over this, and for Democrats to stay at home.
Yeah. Well, you make the point, Kristen, that there is not a woman on the Republican ticket. There is one on the Democrat ticket, at least for now. The question is whether or not she switches positions on it. Earlier today, we spoke about Kamala Harris with Andra Gillespie, political science professor at Emory University. And here's what she had to say about Vice President Harris potentially taking Biden's spot as the presidential nominee.
She has to demonstrate that she can be the leader of the Democratic Party to make voters comfortable with her. And then if it turns out that Biden does drop out of the race, then they're going to have to very quickly settle on who the nominee should be. And she's going to have to be able to project leadership and strength in a way that could help her clear the field if it looks like she's the heir apparent.
Are you confident, Kristen, that Kamala Harris can accomplish that? Or does this convention, if Biden drops out, have to be open?
I don't think it has to be open, but I think, a lot of people have always questioned, I have friends, is she qualified? I was like, well, she was the attorney general of the largest state in the country. Women have to answer questions that men don't. And it's not all about that, but it really kind of upsets me. I mean, so can she do it? Absolutely, she can do it. She can debate. She can be there. Do people like her? Does she have that likability? Another question that women have to answer. So I think, pushing her out there, and if you've seen a lot of the communication coming out of the campaign in the White House, it's a lot more putting her out there front and center. So yes, but what we all have to remember is that for all of us who watch this day to day, the campaign is, a million miles away. The people who are actually voting, they generally start paying attention about 3 weeks out. So there's time here.
Time. And a lot more to follow in this campaign. And of course, we'll keep our panel with us here because we have more to talk about. With the hearing scheduled for next week, it's going to make a lot of news with the head of the Secret Service following the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Saturday, our political panel back with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
clear the agency is not working. It's inexcusable and outrageous, the failures that occurred. It could have resulted in the death of Donald Trump. They clearly were not adequately protecting him that day.
Yes, I do think the director is going to have to leave. She's going to have to resign on this. There will be real accountability. This is the ultimate mission for the Secret Service, is to be able to protect the president. And they were an inch away at that point from having a catastrophic failure.
We'll let the FBI, the Department of Justice, Secret Service do their investigation. But then we should be demanding full transparency.
Voices from the convention: Ohio Congressman Mike Turner, Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, talking with us at the RNC earlier this week on the failures of the Secret Service and the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Back with us now, our political panel ahead of an important hearing on Monday. Kristen, Hawn, and Lisa Camooso Miller are with us. Great to have you both back. Lisa, you spent quite a number of years in the House. You understand how these things work. Oversight is coming after the head of the Secret Service. Joe Biden is the only person who can fire her. You think her resignation letter is written before she testifies?
You know, I'd be surprised if it wasn't. And this is going to be an investigation that for the first time we're going to be talking about this in a way that's really bipartisan. This is about protecting the top official in the United States, right? And this is absolutely the kind of job that if something happens on your watch, you resign. And so I would suspect that that was the case, but there are a lot of questions. And this poor person is going to have to go before the Oversight Committee, who are all very angry, Republicans and Democrats, about what it is that happened last weekend.
Well, and it's worth reminding that what happened last weekend was, yes, Donald Trump did survive being shot at, but someone did die. 2 others were grievously injured, although Donald Trump said in his speech last night they're going to be okay, and he's spoken with them. Kristen, is this a bad look for Biden not to fire her, remembering she's in charge of his protection, too?
I mean, she needs to go, right? I mean, this is a bipartisan thing. I don't know what's going on. She needs to go. I mean, and there needs to be a broader discussion, too, about the resources that the Secret Service has. This is not excusing anything. She has to go. But there needs to be the human resources, the other resources they have.
Great point.
What is happening here, right? So I think I'm glad that this is a bipartisan effort on Capitol Hill where they're bringing her in, and the chairman and the ranking member, said, no, you're coming, and together. And it's not very often we see bipartisan stuff happening. So
You make an important distinction, though. Even if she quit tonight, that doesn't fix some of the trouble following the agency here. That sounds like a much bigger project. How does the president manage that?
Well, I mean, the president himself has every interest in making sure that this is right. But also, to Kristen's point, resources, maybe that's a question, too.
But Homeland Security, in the end, is the one who has to deal with this, right?
Absolutely question. And I read just on my way to talk to you guys is that the local law enforcement is also very angry because they feel as if Secret Service has tossed them into the line of fire on this as well. So there's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of law enforcement involved in this situation. But more than anything else, they need to get to the bottom of what it is that happened and figure it out right away.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we're going to continue to see the details of this investigation coming out, and it's likely to continue for some time to come. It's incredible to think that as we're all here together on this Friday, that is how this week really began. It was almost a week ago, Saturday, the assassination attempt
it was less
on
than
Donald Trump. Less than a week ago. Then we had the convention. J.D. Vance named the vice presidential nominee. Donald Trump accepts. More and more Democrats coming out and saying Joe Biden needs to drop out. Now we're all on tenterhooks this weekend to see if he actually will. Are we ever going to see a week like this again in American politics, Kristen?
Don't say that.
We will.
You're right.
You're right. Until next week.
You're right.
Things are accelerating now, though, right? This is going to be a sprint to the finish for the rest of this
surprise,
campaign.
I mean, we
forget October. About the July surprise.
August, September.
We could have news this weekend.
Yes.
If we do, join us here on Bloomberg TV and radio, because we are prepared to bring you whatever happens on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. That could be Kaylee this weekend, the beginning of next week. We're kind of down to days now from everything that we're hearing.
Indeed. Lisa Camooso Miller and Kristen Hawn, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. Enjoy the weekend. Hopefully it is less eventful for us all. And, of course, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online.
Let's have a quiet one. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Great to be back from Milwaukee, and thanks for coming with us to the RNC. This is Bloomberg TV and radio.